What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Kicking off a new podcast of sorts on my favorite subject matter, MicroStrategy. We'll probably touch on Bitcoin and the broader crypto market a little bit, but mostly MicroStrategy and Bitcoin. I am joined by a very special guest, someone who is very active in the broader MicroStrategy community, but also the irresponsibly long MicroStrategy community, which has had a little bit of a change over the past couple months, dare I say it. But I'm joined here by Peter Duan. How's it going, Peter?
It's going well. Thanks for having me.
Yep. Thanks for coming. So Peter, can you just give the audience a little bit of an idea of who you are professionally?
Yeah. So, like I said, my name is Peter Duan. I've worked in finance for the last 14 years. Did quite a number of different jobs, but long story short, in the last few years, I've pivoted to become a wealth advisor.
Nice. And so MicroStrategy is a very interesting equity, if I can say that. And it's misunderstood, in my opinion, both by finance people and crypto people. Would you agree with that?
Definitely. I think Jeff, Punter Jeff, that's his Twitter handle. His real name is Jeff Alton. He described it really well. So there is already a very small percentage of the world that understands Bitcoin, right? Yep. And then there's a good amount of people in the traditional finance world who understands capital markets. But within capital markets, there are a lot of esoteric subject matters like options, like volatility, we can go so on into that realm. But effectively, the overlap between the two are the people who truly understand MicroStrategy, which seems to be a very small number of people in the world.
Yeah. So just some quick background on my experience with MicroStrategy is I got really into Bitcoin in early 2020. And when I got into Bitcoin, later that year, Michael Saylor burst onto the Bitcoin scene, right? Late 2020, right? And I was like, well, I love this guy. This is awesome, And I was more interested in MicroStrategy for my 401k and IRA exposure, which I think Punter Jeff, who you referenced, talked about. That's how he got into it too. And then also when I started managing my mother's capital before the like when Larry Fink had announced that that BlackRock had filed for the Bitcoin ETF. And when I had heard the statistic that BlackRock had gotten something like 428 out of 429 ETFs across the line. And the one that it didn't get across the line was because of a technicality and they refiled and then it got across the line. So I was like, okay, so this ETF is about to get approved. And that's huge, huge, huge news. Doing a podcast at the time, talking to people like Dan Held and, just learning about the impact of that. So I bought MicroStrategy in my mom's, brokerage accounts because I said to myself, well, this is the only way, this and Coinbase are the only real ways to get proper exposure in an effective way to Bitcoin ahead of this ETF, and I'm going to want to front run this ETF. I then watched MicroStrategy just explode in both my accounts and her accounts from then until really, still exploding till now. And the time I got really into it was when Coinbase announced they were going to buy back their own stock, and Saylor announced the $42 billion plan. That happened like on the same day or within 48 hours of each other or something like that. And the market just loved the MicroStrategy announcement, and the market did not care for the Coinbase announcement. And that's when I was like, okay, I need to get deeper into MicroStrategy. And that's what has me here. Where I'm at now is when MicroStrategy owns 1 million Bitcoins and Bitcoin costs $1 million, then they'll have $1 trillion worth of Bitcoin. How do you even value a company like that? What's a comparable on that?
There is no comparable, first and foremost. The rest of the market is effectively even just waking up to what is the significance of Bitcoin. I know that you guys are in the NFT world, and therefore you guys are not solely in the Bitcoin world.
Crypto world, if you
crypto. Exactly. In the Bitcoin world, we kind of try to separate ourselves from the other crypto assets. I'm not trying to FUD the other crypto projects, but really we think Bitcoin solves a lot of the monetary problem that it is in the world.
I'm a big guy for context. So, and the audience knows that I'm a hardcore Bitcoin guy. So, That they know the Bitcoin situation, Bitcoin, not crypto, the whole thing. But yeah, in the context of MicroStrategy.
Yeah, exactly. And so what I'm trying to get at is, right now there's a lot of narrative out in the Twitter sphere or just in the social media world where you have a pro crypto president, but really, we're trying to focus on Bitcoin and why that is a special investment. But that fast forward, there's a lot of new regulations that are getting improved. For example, like the FASB accounting is getting reversed. So let me just give you a background on that. So up until very recently, if you held Bitcoin on your balance sheet like Tesla did, the accounting standards were such that at any point in the quarter that you're reporting, at the lowest point of that, you have to mark that holding of the Bitcoin down to that level, despite the fact that it ended at an even higher level than that, right? So using very simple math, let's just say, they bought $1 million worth of Bitcoin in the middle of the quarter. It dropped to $500,000, but it ended up at 2 million. No matter what happened, they had to mark it down to the lowest point, right? And so what that does is that it disproportionately affects a company like MicroStrategy, where it's just not accurately valuing the actual assets within the balance sheet. We think that once this FASB accounting rule is implemented, so for example, Tesla just came out with their earnings yesterday, and they already implemented the FASB accounting rule. Now, according to the last earnings report from MicroStrategy, they're planning to do it for the Q1 earnings, which is not this upcoming one, but the one after that. So whether you're thinking about it in the next, couple weeks or a few months, this is going to be a pretty seismic change that's going to wake up Wall Street, because for a long time, Wall Street thinks, hey, this is a Ponzi scheme, right? Because it is, the software business is not growing very well. It's not throwing that much cash flow. How are they able to support such a massive, Ponzi scheme of buying Bitcoin?
Right. Okay, well, fascinating. I mean, I knew about the reversal of the is it SAB 121, the law that Gary Gensler had implemented, but it sounds like this accounting law is actually significantly more impactful for a company like MicroStrategy, because obviously MicroStrategy is not a bank, so that Gary Gensler repeal doesn't really matter. And yet, people don't talk about the fact that Tesla's held Bitcoin on their balance sheet now for almost a half decade. That's pretty significant. And you see the performance of Tesla stock, but obviously that's for a number of reasons. So Peter, can you simply explain, and this might be a challenging question because it seems like nobody can simply explain it, but can you simply explain the different creative techniques that Michael Saylor has implemented and is continuing to implement to raise money to buy Bitcoin?
Yeah, that is a hard thing to kind of do in one sitting, if you will.
Yeah.
First and foremost, you have to understand Bitcoin and why that is important, right? It is the most pristine financial collateral, and it's also very volatile. Now, that volatility, it sounds really crazy because the main financial product that MicroStrategy is providing to the marketplace is volatility, right? That sounds absolutely crazy. Like, what does that even mean? People already hate volatility, right? How's that a product, right? So you have to understand that there are big pockets of money in Wall Street that are not allowed to invest in Bitcoin, right? And they're also they're incentivized differently. So say, for instance, in the convertible bond market, that's one of three ways that MicroStrategy is raising capital. They're trading, they're traders at the end of the day, right? And nothing gets more juicy than when you have a super volatile asset. And nothing is more volatile than Bitcoin, and then Bitcoin and MicroStrategy is just kind of levered Bitcoin. So it is a super volatile asset, right? So why is that important? Well, just high level, like I'm not a options expert by any means, but the more volatile something is, like a call option to buy a stock in the future,
Yep.
the more likely it is that it is going to be in the money, right? Because it swings up and down, and it's more chances of you to be hitting that that in the money zone, right?
Yep.
So that's one way that they raise money is the convertible bond market. And what's very fascinating, and I highly recommend all your viewers to rewatch the Q3 earnings report, is they show the performance of those convertible bonds. Those convertible bonds have outperformed even Bitcoin itself. Okay, so you have to imagine these bond managers and fund managers that are buying these convertible bonds are crushing their competition.
Yeah.
So then, Wall Street people love money, right? And so they're looking at this and they're like, what is going on? Because you usually have, I'm just making up these numbers, but let's just say that they're averaging the average convertible bond and fund manager returns 10%. Well, these guys are yielding 100+%, or whatever, right? The number is, but it's just an order of magnitude, and that is due to the fact that that MicroStrategy is kind of this machine that generates volatility and therefore makes extremely profitable investments for these bondholders. Now, that's one way that they raise money, right? The second
on that one for 1 minute. So, and this is the part that I think people don't understand that I find fascinating, that I think is really key to understand. Those folks, those fund managers buying the MicroStrategy convertible bonds, they can't buy Bitcoin. They can't buy Apple stock. They can't buy chocolate, the commodity, right? And so they only have a fixed set of assets that they can buy. And Saylor has essentially given them a best-in-class option. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, yes. The thing is, Bitcoin, on the surface, sounds really scammy, right? And therefore, you have to dig really deep to really trying to unpack every of those red flags. The same thing can be said about MicroStrategy, right? It's like volatility is vitality. We're creating this is, I'm quoting Saylor, right?
Yep.
He's saying, we're creating a Bitcoin reactor, right? I mean, this just sounds like, what are you talking about, right? But again, you need to really have that deep understanding of Bitcoin fundamentally, but also all of this, pretty esoteric capital markets, and then try to dig deep. So, I fortunately got interviewed by the Wall Street Journal, a few months ago. And that's why in the article I stated, hey, you need to study at least 100+ hours of Bitcoin. And then on top of that, 100 hours of studying MicroStrategy before you can truly kind of grasp both.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. So, okay, moving on to other ways that Saylor is raising money for Bitcoin.
Yes. So the first way, as I said, is the convertible bond market. The second way is they call it ATM, or at the market offering. So what does that mean? So you and me, if we wanted to sell, our stocks, that's easy because there's, we're a tiny little drop in the ocean of trading, right? But if you're someone like a MicroStrategy where you're trying to maybe buy or sell billions of dollars worth of stuff, it's going to move the market, right? And so ATM offering is just a way for them to sell large blocks of their stock, and then they use it to then buy Bitcoin, right? So a lot of people get confused by the fact they're just like, okay, well, let's just say that MSTR MicroStrategy has $500 billion worth of Bitcoin on their balance sheet, and their software business is maybe just 1 or 2 billion of that. So the mass majority is a Bitcoin. Therefore, why are they not trading close to the underlying value, right? Well, said another way, it's this company is creating, using all these financial tools that they're doing, they're creating a metric called Bitcoin yield, right? Yep. So they're using the volatility, they're using the ATM to sell off their stocks to buy Bitcoin. So they're able to effectively create Bitcoin. They're effectively the most efficient Bitcoin miner without having to use energy and to constantly dilute their shareholders to invest in the latest tech. They're able to generate a yield, right? So the best metric that you can look at is the Bitcoin per share metric, right? You see that over time, even with the new dilution of the shares, like ATM is effectively diluting the shares.
Because
right?
they're doing new shares in the process.
Correct, right? But this is also one of those scammy quotes that you need to dig deep to really understand, where the quote is dilution equals accretion, right? Yes. So in this case, they're diluting their shareholders, but they're accreting value because they're buying Bitcoin with it, yes. Right? And so I know going back, I want to take a step back and talk about the convertible bonds, right? Because those convertible bond guys are loving the fact that they're crushing their competition and making a ton of money. They're willing to give MicroStrategy exceptionally great interests in order to buy these bonds, right? So high level, let's just say that these bonds are like, let's just say MicroStrategy is like $400, right? Yep. They issue a new convertible bond. They say, hey, it's a 5-year convertible bond, but we're going to issue it 50% premium to this, right? Well, as a result of this, you're going to give me the money today, but at a very attractive interest rate. So you'll see that oftentimes they can raise billions of dollars at 0% interest rate, right?
Literally zero, or like 0.001?
There's literally zero. Yeah. Like, yes. I mean, not all of them, but like on a blended basis, it's like very low. I don't have it off the top of my head, but I think it's like sub 3%. But there's literally tranches where it's 0%. Okay.
They just want access to what he's going to give them in return.
Correct. Because convertible bonds, listen to the word convertible, right? Yeah. You're a bondholder, but it's a call option to convert it into equity. Yep. So it's like the second that it crosses over to that premium, right? And then you get equity-like returns, right? So these guys are crushing it, right? Like if you think where Bitcoin is going in, let's just say anytime in the next 5 years, it should definitely be greater than 50%. And so every dollar above that amount is just go straight to the bottom line, right? So it's them saying, hey, we can't buy Bitcoin, right? We're only allowed to invest in convertible bonds, but this is a call option for us to do that. And so as a reward for that MicroStrategy, I'm going to lend you this money, right? But for 0% interest, because I know that I'm going to absolutely crush it in the back end.
And
right?
This is the norm for the convertible bond market. So in other words, that conversion, the convertible part, right, when it hits that premium, they're used to that. That's not some new structure, right? And this is just MicroStrategy plugging into that structure?
I'm not that deep into the convertible bond market because that is a very esoteric world. But nothing that MicroStrategy does is conventional, right? There is nothing that is this volatile that people will convert into equity. Matter of fact, a lot of these convertible bond investors, from what I know, are not even allowed to own equity. So like the second that it gets really deep in the money, like they'll just sell it. And then this is a crazy part, right? Because the convertible bonds show up as debt on the balance sheet of MicroStrategy. So the second that they convert, that debt rolls off and their leverage ratios improves. And these guys who want to run it back again, they'll just keep rinsing and repeating, right? So you always have this kind of like deleveraging, re-leveraging component. And so matter of fact, it's hilarious for MicroStrategy insiders like me to hear all these external people who say, "Oh, MicroStrategy is over levered. It's a Ponzi." It's like it's under levered right now. Like that's because of the underlying growth of the value of Bitcoin, plus the fact that some of these convertible debt has now rolled off and converted into equity. So now they're like need to re-lever in order to kind of do this all over again.
And that's also why the debt isn't, or the leverage isn't callable, in the sense that because this is convertible debt, even if Bitcoin went to $1, it's not like there's some liquidation number or some point where he gets margin called. It's just that the equity is worth less. But I heard Michael Saylor say, but that's kind of the point, right? So you're taking on the risk of the equity in MicroStrategy, but it's not some, oh, you're going to get blown up at, X number price for Bitcoin, right?
I love that you bring that up, because you're absolutely right. When the first, kind of got to this point, when they first started implementing the strategy, they had a small portion of their Bitcoin that was collateralized to the Bitcoin. But since then, they're able to pay that off. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Every single Bitcoin is unencumbered by the debt, which means they cannot have a margin call on it. It's just not possible.
Amazing. Incredible. Okay. And so now we've covered convertible debt, the ATM, at the market offering, which is essentially a dilution of shares. In other words, issuing more shares. But because those shares are then used to raise money to buy Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is what it is, which is the greatest commodity, the most pure financial tool in the modern world, it is accretive dilution. In other words, they benefit from that. The math works out in MicroStrategy's favor, just like how if the U.S. government was to print fiat money, which it's doing every single day seemingly,
yes.
and it's been accelerating. If they use that to buy Bitcoin, it actually would benefit them versus, whatever they're using the fiat money for, that debasement. So what is the third way that MicroStrategy raises capital to buy Bitcoin?
Sorry, so I just want to add a little bit more color on the ATM, right?
Sure.
So how I said that they're able to use these kind of like the convertible debt tool to effectively raise billions of dollars,
yep,
0% interest, and then using that to buy Bitcoin. Therefore, they're able to create a way to generate a Bitcoin yield, right? So think about it, like any other company doesn't just trade at 1-to-1 of their earnings, right? That would be a PE ratio of 1.
Right. Like what's Microsoft's PE ratio right now? It ain't 1.
It ain't 1, right? So you're thinking like right now they're like probably trading at like if the FASB accounting rule changes, like they're probably trading at a PE ratio of like 5, right? So you're talking about the fastest growing company with the largest strategic moat of the purest pristine asset that's able to generate a Bitcoin yield that is that is bigger than almost every country at this point, right? So should they not be trading at a multiple to the underlying holdings, right? And so as a result, the answer should be a definitive yes. And therefore, as a result, they're trading at, we call it a multiple to NAV,
yep,
right? That multiple to NAV is like, between 2 and 2.5 right now, right? And so in other words, anything that's greater than 1 MNAV, you can sell it and then buy Bitcoin, and therefore it is accretive, right? So let's just say that MNAV is 2. That's effectively saying, like, let's just say Bitcoin is 100,000 right now.
Yep.
It's effectively saying, hey, I'm selling $100,000 worth of stock to buy Bitcoin, to buy twice the amount of Bitcoin, or to buy Bitcoin at $50,000, right? So as the MNAV expands more, they're able to like apply that leverage, by liquidating it and buying Bitcoin really cheap. Like this is why it's the greatest like financial engineering experiment in history, and most people don't understand.
Okay, and we're going to stay on this for a second because I want to simplify it for some of the audience. It took me a while. I've read a lot about this. I've listened to so many podcasts about this. It took me a while to fully grasp it. And it's also an attack vector against MicroStrategy by people that don't understand it. Like people that don't understand it will say, why would you pay double the price for the same amount of Bitcoin? That's what you hear. Or why would you pay 1.75x, whatever the NAV is at that point? So NAV being a net asset value. So when you're talking about trading at a NAV multiple, then you're talking about the net asset value of the assets that MicroStrategy holds, which is almost entirely Bitcoin. So you can basically just call it Bitcoin, right? And people will say like, oh, well, you're paying for a 2x on that NAV, right? So in other words, I have $100,000 worth of Bitcoin, but I'm being valued like I have $200,000 worth of Bitcoin. But this isn't an ETF. This is a privately held, a publicly traded company. And so they are leveraging that gap there between their actual net asset value and what the market is valuing them at from a, market cap perspective. And they're leveraging that to raise money to buy Bitcoin.
Correct. Correct. And also a major benefit of not being an ETF and being a company is that you get to be included in the major indices. For
Yep.
example, recently in the last quarter, they got included in the Nasdaq 100 or the QQQ, right?
Yep.
Why is that really important? Well, that's because, that's passive money, right?
Yep.
And there's QQQ is one of like the top 5 of the most tracked index and therefore most bought index, right? So a lot of people who are investing in the QQQ are effectively bidding and giving money to MicroStrategy. And the thing is that it's market cap weighted. So if you're the largest company in there, you get the largest percentage, right? So it becomes this reflexive wheel as Bitcoin gets bigger, as they do more of this accretive dilution or this convertible bond stuff. And then the third thing I'm going to talk about, which is in preferred stock, it compounds and they quickly move up the Nasdaq 100. And as that happens, there's just literally more and more passive money that comes. So it becomes a snowball. And then also we hope and we think that they're going to qualify for the S&P 500 later this year. So that's kind of another major catalyst of more passive purchase power that an ETF will not ever be able to touch.
Well, that's a big one. And wait, doesn't MicroStrategy already qualify for it? Do you mean by it'll actually get into the S&P 500?
So the S&P 500, from what I understand, is more, it's less formulaic.
Yeah.
More just like, it's by committee, right? And so you really have to think, well, are those people who are, running that fully understanding of Bitcoin, right? The thing is that these indices all want to compete against each other, and so if they want by the way, MicroStrategy is by far the best performing stock, like major large cap stock for the last 4 years.
That's NVIDIA.
They smoke NVIDIA, okay, despite the recent drops, okay? So they have to think, if I don't allow MicroStrategy into S&P 500 right now, nothing stops this Bitcoin train. So if they qualify, if they were to go into S&P 500 today, they'll be like around 100, right, of the 500th company, right?
Yeah.
If they wait for another year, it may be like top 20, and at that point, like that's like a huge amount of passive money that goes to buy MicroStrategy. So just like how we Bitcoiners say, like, nothing stops the Bitcoin train, nothing really stops this MicroStrategy train as well. So it behooves the S&P 500 to not include it as soon as possible.
You mean it behooves them to include it as soon as
sorry, exactly. Yeah. Like they better do it, or else like they're only going to regret it, because they're going to need to do it no matter what down the road. Right?
And that's the beautiful thing. They're incentivized to put it in, and you can only put back against incentives for so long. They're going to in. And just to simplify that one more time. So these indices like the S&P 500, there's passive flows because, my uncle owns the S&P 500 because it's, the top performing index fund of the last 40 years, right? He's not buying MicroStrategy stock, right? But then if MicroStrategy is in the S&P 500, anytime he dollar cost averages into the S&P 500, or anytime anybody puts $1 into the S&P 500, a fraction of that goes directly to MicroStrategy, because that's just how it works.
That's correct.
And that's what's happening with the QQQ right now, which was a huge deal. Was priced in, in terms of just the day over day, the price performance. And so let's talk about the third way, the preferred stock. And then I want to dig into the P ratio stuff a little bit, because are you familiar with British HODL?
I am.
So he's really big on that talking point and pointing out that MicroStrategy should be trading like a Mag 7 stock, and holy crap, is the price going to go up if that's the case? But anyway, let's talk about preferred stock here.
So this is something that's very new, and it's still being digested on my end. So
STRK, are we talking about STRK?
Yes, correct. So MicroStrategy very recently, in the last week or two, announced that they're tapping into the preferred stock world, right? So preferred stock acts both like a stock and a bond in the regards that it pays a dividend. So this time it's going to be an 8% fixed dividend on $100 purchase, right? And then it's like but it's a perpetual vehicle as opposed to like a convertible bond, right? So I don't like, again, I'm still digesting it. It's not live from what I understand yet. So I don't want to talk too much about it. Next time, if I'm back on this great show, I will definitely have digested by then, and also would have some more data points on how it's being received by the market. But they issued a filing saying that they're issuing up to $2 billion of preferred, but I think they're just dipping their toes in by doing, I think, a $250 million sell. But if you follow some of the really smart guys on Twitter, Ben Workman is one of those guys who does really good deep dive analysis. He has broken it down, and it seems to be very, very accretive, even more accretive than the convertible bonds.
And is this sailor going after another, pocket of institutional capital that can't, just like the convertible bond stuff, they can't buy Bitcoin, they can't buy MicroStrategy equity, they can't, buy chocolate commodities, they can only buy preferred stock, and thus he's giving them something to buy?
That's absolutely correct, right? If you like, there is roughly $900 trillion worth of assets in the world.
Yeah.
So like a huge percentage of that have yields or returns that are below that of the monetary increase, right? Yeah. Which a lot of people don't realize that inflation measured by CPI is not nearly as accurate as monetary supply measured by M2, yep. Right? And that's around, call it 7 or 8%. Mm-hmm. So in other words, if you are not investing in anything that is consistently yielding 7 or 8%, you are losing purchase power. And so why I say that is the convertible bond market is dying for what MicroStrategy has. The preferred equity is dying. Anything really that is not high yielding, especially in the fixed income world, is dying for high yield. And so that's where MicroStrategy is playing. That's their best customers. They're large pools of untapped capital that is dying for the product.
Are there more pools he'll be able to tap into then?
I'm sure there is. I wish I can peek into the brain of Michael Saylor. Maybe my head will explode if I did that even for a second, but I'm sure they're in the works. So Michael Saylor has publicly stated that they want to be a Bitcoin bank down the road.
Yep.
So, as you imagine, banks have a plethora of financial products. They're only on the third, and the third hasn't even rolled out. And so if you can just look at what 4 years have done for them, right? They're close to now 500,000 Bitcoin. So yeah, the world is their oyster.
Incredible. Absolutely incredible. So quickly on the PE ratio stuff, then I want to talk about the broader ecosystem at this point with, I know you're not an options guy, but I think that you probably have some surface level knowledge at least about MSTX and MSTY, MSTY. Yes. And who those, who should take a look at those and who those assets are for. But on the PE ratio stuff, do you think that there's real weight to what British HODL is talking about in the sense that it should trade more like a Microsoft or an NVIDIA in terms, like a Mag 7 stock versus, people trying to almost compare it to an ETF?
I don't. I have a word of respect of what he does and says, but this is where him and I differ. Mm-hmm. That is because there's only going to be 21 million Bitcoin, right? Yep. And so I can argue both ways, right? So some people say, are there going to be greater than 21 million Bitcoins worth of assets? Maybe, right? Punter Jeff thinks that, and Michael Saylor says, not everything is going to flow into Bitcoin. Bitcoin is going to be a large percent of the overall assets in the world. So it can trade, yeah. If I were to argue it, I'd say, it won't trade 50x PE multiple because there's only so much Bitcoin. They will asymptotically approach, 21. They'll never get close, but it will trend close to 21 million over time, but they're only going to asymptotically approach that. But then on the other side, is there value greater than 21 million Bitcoin that MicroStrategy can acquire? I don't know. It's a very philosophical question, but a 50x P ratio, I don't know, it doesn't really make sense, especially when you use the metric of a Bitcoin yield, right? If you're going to measure things, you got to be apples to apples in how you measure things, and they're measuring it by Bitcoin per share. Mm-hmm. So since no more than 21 million Bitcoin is going to be produced, I have a hard time kind of visualizing, like a 50 PE ratio, if you will.
So if we think philosophically for a moment, a situation where maybe you would say that is possible would be like almost like, what if the next 12 years, count from when MicroStrategy first started acquiring Bitcoin, those first 12 years are the major Bitcoin accumulation period. And then the next 6, 7, 8 years are when they actually start building lines of business around the Bitcoin, because you can actually do that at that time. And there's, more opportunity to create interesting instruments with Bitcoin and things like that. Would that make you think, okay, maybe we can start talking about like that? Because then it's more like a Bitcoin bank or a really sophisticated technology company built off of Bitcoin.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. I can definitely confirm that they are trying to front run everybody right now, and that's because in this cycle particularly, a lot of people like me assume that it is a super cycle because we're getting sovereign wealth interest, right? Through funds. We're getting some central bank interest, like the Czech Republic, I think, are recommending to buy Bitcoin. We're getting our own analysis on a strategic Bitcoin reserve. There are statewide legislation to do a strategic reserve. There's just all of these these big pools of money that are now taking Bitcoin seriously. So Michael Saylor is just trying to get in front of that massive trend.
Yeah. And one comment, because you brought up the moat earlier, because a lot of people, I don't think understand this. MicroStrategy has something like 470,000 Bitcoins right now he's buying every Monday. He's bought every Monday for, I don't even know how many weeks at this point, a few months. And obviously not really slowing down in any significant way. And like you said, he's trying to front run everything. So I saw a tweet where somebody did the math. And the math worked out. I don't know if this is 100% accurate, but the math worked out that something like only 8 companies in the world, and obviously they are the biggest companies in the world, the names that like Microsoft and others, would be able to catch up to MicroStrategy in terms of the number of Bitcoins owned. And if they did want to do that, they'd have to start right now, and they'd have to dedicate everything to Bitcoin accumulation, just like MicroStrategy has. And we just saw Microsoft, vote against buying any amount of Bitcoin, not about adopting a Michael Saylor MicroStrategy strategy for Bitcoin, but just to buy any Bitcoin. They said no. I think the only big name company that I can think of, it would be Tesla, that holds Bitcoin on their balance sheet. Obviously, you have Mara and like Bitcoin miners, but yeah, it makes sense that they would have Bitcoin on their balance sheet. That makes perfect sense. And some smaller companies, I don't remember all their names, but Saylor has co-signed them as being on a Bitcoin standard. I'll just buy MicroStrategy. I don't need to play around with the second best. But that moat is something that doesn't get discussed enough, right? I mean, no one can catch up to what MicroStrategy has done already, and they're not stopping.
Yeah, they're not stopping. And you have to think, right? They're one of one because 99% of their value is attributed to the Bitcoin holdings. Even if these big 7 companies or whatever, and they start now, the mass majority of their business is their business, and therefore, even if they converted $100 billion into Bitcoin, they're never going to perform like MicroStrategy, where it is very volatile, but that volatility is the catnip that attracts Wall Street money, right? So MicroStrategy, when they first implemented the strategy, it was a defensive strategy where Michael Saylor was sitting on half a billion dollars worth of cash, and he's looking around at the money printing. He says, this is a melting ice cube. Yep. So then he buys the Bitcoin, right? But now, as time has evolved, he's now playing an offensive strategy using the volatility of the Bitcoin. So no matter what, even if these Magnificent Seven companies converted all of their money into Bitcoin, yes, it would do well for their stock, right? Because Bitcoin's value is going to go up, but that it's not going to be like the main product the way MicroStrategy is, right? And how it can attract institutional money like that.
Incredible. So speaking of volatility, we've got a couple of, they're not new. They've been out for like a year or something, a little bit less than a year. But I feel like they're going viral now. These ETFs in the, call it MicroStrategy ecosystem, two big name ones are MSTX and MSTY, very, very different ETFs. Maybe let's talk about MSTY first. It's a little bit more conservative than MSTX. MSTY, I've heard people call it MSTY, is the yield max ETF for MicroStrategy, and it's designed to generate high yield. It's over 100% yield annually. And so I guess 11% per month, it seems. It will underperform MicroStrategy, but I think it has a place in some investors' portfolios. What is your opinion and what are your thoughts on MSTY?
Yeah, I've become a big fan of MSTY. So effectively what they're doing is they're doing a sophisticated options play called a synthetic long.
Yeah.
So they're effectively buying call options and put options at the same price, right? And so this effectively creates a synthetic version of owning the underlying stock. Well, then the question becomes, well, why not just own the underlying stock? Well, it's because there is this less capital requirements because of using of leverage. And really taking a step back, MSTY or MSTY is a yield play, right? It's a way to generate cash flow.
Yes.
So I had a tweet recently that said, MSTY, MicroStrategy, is investing, right, on the equity side.
Yep.
MSTY or MSTY is yield or on the dividend cash flow.
Yeah,
right?
cash.
And Bitcoin is saving.
Yep.
Right. So long story short, MSTY, what it does is it sells effectively these options for you to generate that yield. Now, as you already mentioned, since its history, it's generated about 100% yield, right? Which is really impressive. I think it's on par with, it's really impressive. Let's just say that, right? So effectively, you're paying them a modest fee. It's 99 basis points, right? 100 basis points is 1%, so it's 0.99%.
Yep.
Effectively, for them to do these, to manage these options for you. I think it's a very phenomenal tool. But that being said, there are two things that you should be aware of. Okay. The first thing is that it will underperform MicroStrategy in a bull run, right? Yep. I won't get into the option stuff, but there's theta decay, there's mismanagement of buying and selling options, so on and so forth, right? And B, you cannot past performance is not indicative of future performance. In a bear market, there is going to be NAV decline, yep, right? And then I don't know how volatile the underlying stock is in a bear market, so the yield can get compressed doubly. So you're getting this, negative NAV and a negative yield. Like you may not like that. But that being said, most people don't get into MicroStrategy and MSTY because they're risk averse. But just as a wealth advisor, I have to just disclose that.
Of course. And I mean, yeah, so like our audience is for sure not risk averse, definitely in favor of risk, because to me, crypto is risk, the crypto side, like guys trading meme coins and stuff like that. A lot of times they consider, assets like MicroStrategy boring, or they're just uninterested because it's a US equity and that's just not the game that they're interested in playing. But you can get pretty risky with some of this stuff. I mean, even with MSTY, I was thinking about it. If you traded or bought MSTY on margin, the performance of MSTY is going to outweigh, like the yield that you get is going to be more than what you pay in interest for margin. So if you like risk, obviously that is a risky strategy, but there's a lot of opportunity here. On the income side, I saw your tweet. I loved it. That was a very simple and phenomenal way to kind of describe the three tools. When I think about income, a lot of crypto and Bitcoin investors are irresponsibly long in the sense that they don't have huge cash positions lying around, like including myself. Like I'm essentially fully invested in Bitcoin, MicroStrategy, Tesla, and some crypto stuff. Like I'm just fully invested. I have income and I take the excess income and I invest it. I have enough money for a rainy day in cash. But other than that, I'm all the way in. If I bought $50,000 or $75,000 worth of Misty and started earning something in the ballpark of $5,000 to $7,500 a month, that's pretty interesting to me. Is it going to outperform the same amount of capital deployed into MicroStrategy? Yes. But for someone like me, I almost need to slow myself down a little bit and give myself an income generating play on top of just income generated from your profession. I don't know. Is that an okay, like, would you think about it in a similar way? Like, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I definitely would. It's interesting. I have some clients who are very asset rich, but liquid.
Yeah.
So that's how you got to manage it, right? It's like, I hate the phrase, now that we're Bitcoiners, that cash is king, but it's still in a fiat world, cash is king, right? Like you can't pay in MicroStrategy shares, you can't pay at most places with Bitcoin. So therefore you need to manage your cash strategy. But unlike you, I have a rainy day fund that has 3 months worth of living expenses, but everything else I fully poured into what you mentioned, because otherwise it's a melting ice cube sitting at room temperature.
Makes sense. MSTX and our audience member Discourse here, who I was chatting with earlier via our morning show, he pointed out MSTU. I haven't looked into MSTU. I own MSTX. I'm deploying, or I'm implementing a covered call strategy on MSTX because the premiums are very similar to MicroStrategy premiums, which makes sense because it's 2x volatility of MicroStrategy. But the price of one share of MSTX is significantly cheaper than MicroStrategy. So to sell a covered call, you only need like $5,000, whereas with MicroStrategy, you need $40,000 of MicroStrategy, right? And plus, I don't care if my MSTX shares get called. I care if my MicroStrategy shares get called. I'm willing to trade MSTX. I'm not willing to trade MicroStrategy. But what are your thoughts on MSTX?
So MSTX and MSTU are both relatively similar. What they offer is they call it 2x leverage, but if you really read the prospectus, they're always targeting 2x leverage. And so there are many periods where it's severely on the upside underperformed 2x, but on the downside has underperformed 2x, more than underperformed 2x. And that is because they use options, right? So there was a recent Wall Street Journal article about these levered products, and these products, the founders of these products were trying to use swaps in order to get their leverage and to effectively get their exposure. But then because of how volatile MSTR is, they couldn't get enough swaps and they had to reach into the options market. So that's why they've been underperforming. And so there'll be days where MicroStrategy will be flat, but they'll be underperforming by like a percentage. And that is because of something called theta decay in the options, which simply theta just means time. As more time transpires, you lose more value in the options underneath, right? And so despite how gigabull I am of MicroStrategy, I am generally quite bearish on MSTU and MSTX because it's effectively a degen play.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I've tried to dabble in it on 3 separate occasions because I thought, like this is when the market is going to rip, right? And I'm going to be cute with it. Every single time I got cut up, right? Every single time, and and so I think at this point I learned my lesson. I like to think I did, and so I'm just spot MSTR. So Bitcoin already moves quite fast for most people, but the MSTR is like a bullet train that will just cut up and cut down, right? I mean, a lot of people think like, oh, volatility equals vitality, and that sounds good and sexy when it's on the way up, but then volatility is also on the way down as well. And Michael Saylor has actually engineered the stock to act like that for the benefit of his main clients, which are these traders that I was talking about.
Yeah, and when you're buying MSTX, you're not buying what MicroStrategy's and Michael Saylor's vision is. You're buying people taking his vision and Frankensteining it in many ways. Yeah. So okay,
I want to add one thing though. Okay.
Sure.
I really want you, if you are degen enough to want to do that, which again I wouldn't, but I would really study it in the regards that it resets on a daily basis. So what I mean by that, let's just say that I'm just making up basic numbers so you can understand the premise, right? Let's say MicroStrategy is at $500 today. It goes to 1,000, right? So that's 100% return, right? But let's just say that MicroStrategy drops 50%, so it's back at $500. Well, if it is a levered product, and supposedly it does that perfect 2x, you're wiped out completely, right? It resets on a daily basis. So despite the fact that if you held spot MSTR, you would have stayed flat, on MSTX and MSTU, you would have been completely wiped out.
Yeah, very good to know. And just for people in the audience, there was a lot of interest in the option stuff. I have a full-time options trader coming on at this time next Thursday. So it'll be an options conversation for next Thursday. I told him that we're going to talk about Tesla, MicroStrategy, MSTX, and everything in between. So Peter, I know you got to go in a few minutes. Just a couple more questions. I hate price predictions, and I'm even uncomfortable bringing them up. But the thing that's been rattling around in my mind, knowing the things that we've discussed today, is how is this company an $88 billion company right now? I do not understand how the market caps can still be under $100 billion. Do you think that $1 trillion is in the cards in the next 5 years? / do you think that it's on the table for this year? That's punter Jeff's position, is he thinks $1 trillion is on the table for this year. I would love to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I too am not a big fan of price predictions. I am pretty comfortable in saying in the next 5 years, it would be a $1 trillion company, especially because of the game theory of Bitcoin. And that's what makes Bitcoin very unique, is that everybody who understands Bitcoin understands there's a hard, perfectly inelastic supply of 21 million. And so the sooner that people realize, the sooner they're going to pull a Michael Saylor or me in the regards that I'm just dumping every disposable income into Bitcoin and Bitcoin proxies. That's going to spark a major rush. So it's completely in the cards in 5 years. I would say like an 80% sure. In the next year, I don't know. I think maybe 25%. But yeah, I like to just take a directional bet and not have too much of a time pressure on myself, because that's where people get messed up, is that they're trying to be impatient, and greed breeds hubris.
Even Michael Saylor said in a talk that he gave like 15 years ago that the only time he lost money with Apple stock is when he bought a call option on it. And his prediction would have been right if it was like a month later. Like if the expiration date was like a month later. So anyway, I appreciate that answer. Last question, any other equities or assets outside of Bitcoin and MicroStrategy that you find really, really interesting? I'm a Tesla guy. I don't know if there's anything else that you're interested in anywhere that even can come close to how interesting MicroStrategy and Bitcoin are.
I'm a Tesla guy myself, but I liquidated my Tesla for MicroStrategy because of the various catalysts that I talked about today, and some that I didn't talk about. But I'm a fan of Tesla. I like to just, like, since I'm in the Bitcoin ecosystem, I want to see what are the various other ways that are people manifesting Bitcoin into their financial life. So one company that I have an eye on that I find deeply interesting is Metaplanet. Yep. You can think of it as the Japan's MicroStrategy. Yep. It's ran by a super sharp young gentleman by the name of Dylan LeClaire. He is effectively copying the MicroStrategy playbook, but yeah, they're doing like, it's really nice to see what they're doing, because there's multiple MSTR copycats, but Metaplanet is the one that is executing the closest to MicroStrategy. Okay,
and last thing, you said some of the catalysts that you didn't talk about today. Can you give us like a quick synopsis of some of the stuff we didn't cover?
Let's see. Yeah, so I mostly said that because like there are just always so many things that are evolving, right? Um, I don't I don't have one that's off the top of my head that really is like the near term catalyst. But yeah, I think I said most of them. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Peter, thank you so much. Where can people find you? They should follow you on Twitter without question. Your Twitter handle is
My Twitter handle is BTC Bull Rider.
BTC Bull Rider. Give him a follow on Twitter. Really, really good insight into MicroStrategy and obviously Bitcoin in general. Peter, thanks for joining today, man.
Thank you. Bye.
We'll catch you guys next week, next Thursday. Thanks for listening. See ya.